So we have one last thing left to do, and that's the final rendering. So let's jump around a bit in the settings to check all the essential things we'll need for high quality final image. So the first thing to check is output size. In our studio, we usually use 5,000 pixels on the larger side for our final images. And if the image is widescreen, we use 5,000 pixels wide. If we set it to 5,000 pixels right here, and we have the image aspect parameters locked, then the height will automatically adjust to that size as well. So as you can see, my image is square, so its size is 5,000 by 5,000 pixels. Of course, you should understand that not everyone has computers that are powerful enough to do this, and you don't always need such high quality image. Sometimes a smaller resolution is enough. On average, final quality is considered an image of about 25 by 5000 pixels. Depends on the client's wishes. If the image is vertical, then the larger side is considered the height. And here we set the size of the image in pixels. So we have an output format that we will render the final image in. Next we go to Scene tab, and here we need to set the noise level limit value. Of course, there are other options to limit the rendering by number of passes or by time, but I think the best option is to limit the noise level, because this way we can get a great quality image. Of course, it will take a bit longer to render, but we won't sacrifice quality for time. Some people will be fine with a pass limit, for example, but I can't really calculate how many passes I'll need to get quality images in advance. So 99% of the time, I recommend using noise level limit. Usually, we set a value of 3%. A value of 2% provides a fairly high quality image, which is not much different from what 3% gives, but the rendering time increases tremendously. So by trial and error, we came up with the perfect value of 3%. In some cases, if you're doing previews, for example, you may want to use a value of about 4% for your image. You can use whatever you're more comfortable with, but I recommend 3%. So the next thing to look at is denoising box. If you're working with the final image, you can use denoising parameter, and I recommend using Corona high quality mode. In this case, denoising will be of the highest quality. As for the amount parameter, we have also found the optimal value of about 0.3 or 0.4. This is enough to smooth out the image, and at the same time, the denoising parameter does not hide any minor details. If your image is very large, like about 5,000 pixels on the large side, then I would not use denoising if I were you, because there's a lot of detail in the image. The resolution is very high, and the noise will not be visible in this case. We can leave all other options, such as camera, performance, and system as default. They don't really affect anything, but it's very important to customize the render elements that you'll need later for post-production of your image. I'm going to show you some render elements that I recommend to use for high quality image processing. Of course, Corona and Vray have a lot of render elements, but most of them are hardly used at all. So let's start from the bottom up. First of all, I recommend using C-masking wire color. So this is a mask that contains object's color. Let me select some objects. For example, a couch. And you see that its wireframe color is black, and this render element looks like this. And this creates a colored mask that will allow you to separate different objects from one another. If you need to do post-production, for example, to lighten something, make it brighter, and so on. Sometimes we just need to customize some particular objects. So I recommend adding sea masking wire color by default. And I also recommend colorizing your wire. So let's take the ceiling, for example. And it seems to be defined as a single object with the walls. And so let's take this book here, because it's also green as this stand here. So we can change the wire color to red, and then this object will be a red. And then in Photoshop, it will be easy to select this object by color and separate into a different layer. And that's very useful. Next, if you already know that you will need to edit some object on your render, for example, you need to change the color of the floor or the color of the cabinet, you can create a separate mask for this object. You can do this by using a sea masking mask render element. So let's click here and find the render element, sea masking, mask. There are gbuff and ID settings here, but it's best to add it manually. So we check manual selection box here. I've selected the floor object and then click this plus button, and now a separate mask is created. On the render, it will look like this. Sea masking mask looks like a white mask. And this will be very handy for editing. For selecting this object separately in Photoshop, if you need to make it lighter, brighter, or change its color a little bit. And this way we can make a separate mask for each object that we're going to edit. Now, of course, I recommend that you don't get too carried away with this and add these masks only when necessary. And I also recommend renaming this render element right away. For example, here, I'll call it floor. And that way I will know that this is a separate mask for the floor. Okay, what else? Now, we may also need reflections. And here I'm gonna add Essential Reflect. And we need this in case we wanna edit the image and add extra highlights. It looks like this. It's like some kind of mask. See that now only the reflections are selected. In some cases, this will help us highlight mirrors or some reflections on the floor and glass objects, for example. So that's also very useful. One last thing that you can utilize is a separate alpha channel. If you don't use the background behind the window as a separate object and would rather paste it in Photoshop, then I recommend adding shading alpha just to be safe. So this is an essential set of render elements that you may need when editing your image in Photoshop. Of course, there are a large number of specific render elements that allow you to more fine-tune your post-production in Photoshop. There are individual masks like refract, which will allow you to create separate masks if you have glass in your scene, for example. Or there's translucency, which you can use for curtains and fabrics and things like that. But by and large, you don't use all of these things that much. So I've shown you a really essential set of masks. There are wire color, a separate render element, sea masking, reflect, and alpha channel. That pretty much covers probably 95% of all the render elements you need for all occasions in your work. All right. So the last thing we can customize is render queue. If you have multiple cameras in your project, I would recommend you use batch render. It works as follows. We go to the rendering box and select batch render. And this is a fairly simple panel where we add cameras that we're working with. So this is how it works. Simply click add to get a view that you can customize. Here you can rename it. Let's call it camera main room. And then in the output path box, specify the path with your images. And let me also specify the path and the name of the file. Now, of course, this should be the path to your project. Then you simply choose file type, such as Corona EXR or PNG. Now, I like to use EXR for these files so that I can take some render elements from there if needed. So I save it all into one single file. I click save, and then we can change resolution, we can change format, or we can just use the one that's default in 3ds Max. I'm not gonna touch anything here for now. And next, we need to select the camera that we're gonna use for rendering. Otherwise, you might not get anything. Select the camera that you want to use, and as you can see, the light sources are also here, so don't mix them up. Only use the camera that is right for your view. For example, in this scene, it will be main room, and that's it. Now this view is set up, and I can delete extra ones to make things a little bit easier. You can click duplicate and just rename the camera. For example, main room 03. Then click output path, and here we have to overwrite the name of the files. In the bonus materials, you'll find the entire workflow of the project with guides on how to properly name the files so you don't get confused. So next we select another camera, and we now have two views. And next we click render, and we get a queue of rendering all these cameras. So when the first camera is rendered and the noise level reaches 3%, the file will be saved, and then the next camera will start to render. If for some reason you don't want to use batch render, for example, if you have only one image, you can just run the render and manually save it, or select a path to save this render using render output panel. All you need to do is click Files, specify the path of the file you're saving, click Save, and run the render. But if you're using multiple cameras, it's best to do it with batch render. Alright everybody, that's it for now. I wish you good luck with your rendering, and I'll see you in the next lesson.